Hello, everyone. Welcome to Free Kiwis. Today we have a very special guest, Roslyn Fuller. She is, well, first and foremost, I believe, a Canadian. And not only that, but a Canadian with some love for German culture. And in fact, you did your PhD in international law in Germany, right?
Actually, I studied international law in Germany, so I did my bar exam there. And then I moved to Ireland and I did my PhD in Ireland.
Oh, okay, right. And then you lectured for a while, I think, in Trinity and a few other places. And now
Yeah,
you
exactly.
are the director of the Solonian Democracy Institute. And you've written these two wonderful books, Beasts and Gods, How Democracy Changed Its Meaning and Lost Its Purpose, which, as I was just saying to you before the podcast started, it basically, I agree with it completely. I wish I'd written this book in some ways. And then the next one I've just started, In Defense of Democracy. So, so I wanted to start actually with the Beasts and Gods book because it kind of presents a history of democracy from the ancient Greeks to now. So maybe could you just start by laying out what your vision is for the history of democracy? Where do you think it sort of started out, and has it sort of just continued in the way you would have liked it to have continued, or has it sort of declined in some ways? Why don't you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, when I first started doing my PhD, coming from a legal background, we had this kind of intensely legal view of democracy, and we would see it as very much kind of a rights-based thing. So, do you have freedom of the press? Do you have freedom of speech? These kinds of things were, kind of a legal way of looking at it. But I kind of felt like I was going in a circle doing that kind of thing and looking at it that way. So I began to look, and this was at the suggestion of my doctor father, to put it in a German way, my supervisor. I began to look at historical democracy and what democracy originally meant. And that was so fascinating to me because I discovered, as you well know, that democracy was practiced in a very, very different way in ancient Greece than we do it today. And that people didn't have such a positive view of elections back then as they do today, that there is much more of an emphasis on citizen involvement at all stages of government. And that, I'm not going to say it's been lost. That's one way of looking at it, that it's been lost. Of course, we would have to say it's been lost a really long time ago in that sense. What we had is kind of a revival of those ideas combined, I would say, with Roman Republican ideas back during the Enlightenment. And the founding fathers of America, when they were designing what we now call the democracy of America, but which they called a republic, were very, very much influenced by Roman ideas of how a government should function. And that had some elements of consent, like an abnormally high level elements of consent for the time, but was still very different than democracy in that people were less involved. The average person was less involved in decision making. And we kind of just adopted that wholesale due to the founding fathers. And that's kind of what we think of democracy today, is a sort of republican system that they developed and that they then began to conflate eventually in America and in other countries with this idea of democracy, which means people power, actually, So it's kind of more like been lost, semi-rediscovered, and now we're complaining that the system doesn't do what we want it to do because it hasn't been designed really to do what we want it to do. We don't use the institutions today of ancient Greek democracy. We use a kind of amalgamated form of Roman Republican institutions with a bit of human rights thrown in.
To what extent do you think Enlightenment democracy was directly influenced by the Greek ideas of democracy? I mean, you mentioned the founding fathers of America who specifically put in place a republic. But of course, in Europe, democracy also took root in various kinds of soil, including revolutionary France and monarchist England. So to what extent can we look at it as a unified thing, and to what extent does it owe direct influence of Greek ideas?
Yeah, well, it's definitely very much a mishmash because, of course, whenever you apply something to real life, it's kind of like a war, You don't take this idea or this blueprint and you're like, oh, yep, that's how we did it, There's always this kind of like fight over how you're going to implement ideas. So, yes, a lot of Greek ideas apparently came to Europe after the Byzantine Empire collapsed. and a lot of people from there came to Europe. And because the printing press was invented at roughly the same time period, a lot of their texts began to flow into European thought, and those texts became more widely available to thinkers in Europe at that time, right? And Greek became more widely spoken than it had been. So they definitely influenced people. However, a lot of the texts themselves that come from democracy are quite, the ancient Greek democracy are quite anti-democratic. So most of the people who bother to write big long books, like Plato or Thucydides, were not very fond of democracy. And I think that also played into influencing that thought. This idea that democracy, was very interesting in some ways, like definitely achieved great things, but also this idea that it was very dangerous, that it was mob rule and despotic and so on and so forth. And it's kind of like an elite addressing another elite. So you had these elite people in ancient history who, of course, were the only people really who had time on their hands to write these big, long pieces of work and have them distributed in any way. And an elite that's reading these. So there's kind of a combination of interest there for quite a long time, with some exceptions, like someone like Rousseau was more pro-democracy than a lot of other philosophers during, the French Revolutionary period, roughly. But I don't think that view really was able to bring itself through. And you see that somewhat reflected in also the debate in North America. There was a big debate. There was the Founding Fathers, the Federalists, but there are also a group called the Anti-Federalists. And they had a quite long-standing debate between them about how government should be arranged in North America. And the Federalists won that debate. They were less participatory than the Anti-Federalists were. The Anti-Federalists wanted small groups of people who would debate more with each other on a kind of a state level rather than a national level. That wasn't necessarily, full-blown democracy, but it was more democratic than what the Federalists wanted. That's one factor. A second factor is, of course, at the time it was really hard. You have these big nation states now. France is a lot bigger than and England are both much bigger than ancient Athens was. So you have that impracticality as well, that it would be very, very hard, for example, a modern state like France or the United States to have the institutions of ancient Athens, which required face-to-face interaction.
Yeah, that's one of the things that Madison was worried about, although, in fact, Madison thought it would be an advantage, right? Because you have so many people in a larger nation state that for him, the dangers of faction would be lessened, although it seems at the moment that hasn't actually come to pass. But no, you're right. I mean, in some ways, if you look at the Anti-Federalists and some of what was going on in American politics before the Union, you've got Rhode Island, for example, which had very short, I believe, 6-month term limits. And they were basically coerced, I believe, into the USA in the end, if I remember that correctly. So I think it's also very important that what you said there is that to remember that it's not a direct transmission, and it's very easy to sort of parody the view that we just come from the ancient Greeks, and I don't think that's really correct. And I think that you do it right in your book. It's not that we just continued ancient Greek democracy. In fact, as you say, most of the history that was written by elite Europeans, a lot of the elite Europeans who wrote history, they saw a lot to agree with in Thucydides. But I do think that those democratic ideas, those Greek texts, which had some reference to democracy in them, to demokratia in them, they kind of stayed around in the Western tradition. And for me, that maybe wasn't the most important factor in producing what we now have in terms of representative democracy. But I think it did play a role. But anyway, let me ask you. So one question that I always get, and I think it's a fair question when you're talking about ancient Greek democracy and how we can learn from it, is, well, were these really democracies at all? Because, of course, in Athens, they had slaves, they excluded women, also excluded foreigners. Even if you lived in Athens for a long time, you couldn't vote. So, maybe this is just some kind of elite ruling over other people.
Yeah, I get that question every time I talk about democracy as well. Obviously that's true. We know that, and we know that is true about the vast majority of societies of that time. So I think a misconception people have is that, ancient Greece and Rome had slaves and everyone else didn't know what that was, or not even didn't know what that was, but were actively against slavery, which is a very rare, the further back in history you go, the kind of more rare that thought becomes. So one thing we have to acknowledge is that this wasn't unique to them. It didn't really have a direct bearing on the form of government. There were plenty of people who lived in more monarchical societies, or more oligarchical societies, or more aristocratic societies that also didn't see a problem with having slaves. So that was kind of very much in the culture of their time for a whole lot of different reasons, right? They didn't live like we did today. It was a lot more survivalist for everybody. And, if you look at the way they conducted war, not just the Athenians, really everyone around them, they would have conducted war in many ways, many times in a way that we today would just call completely genocidal, right? I mean, It didn't acknowledge the laws of war we have today in any way, shape, or form. So I think to some extent, when we look at history at all, but especially ancient history, we kind of start to look at it a bit anachronistically sometimes, and we see it through the lens of what we consider acceptable today. And then we say, well, they didn't do this or they didn't do that. This is true, but they were also living under very different circumstances. And you can say that a correlation is not a causation. So the fact that the Athenians didn't get rid of slavery, certainly you're right. Like they just didn't get that far, right? They didn't get to the point where they're like, hey, maybe this is a really bad idea and we could do things a lot better. Sometimes you read things that kind of sort of go a little bit in that direction, but as a society, they didn't get there. That's true. But that doesn't necessarily mean that democracy caused slavery. So,
indeed. And perhaps the fact that it never would have occurred to them to do away with slavery is more or less the same reason why the concept of universal suffrage would never have occurred to them either. Yeah. I mean, of course, with the early Enlightenment democracies, there was still slavery in the US in particular. It was very much on its way out in the United Kingdom or in England. But then in the next century, we saw both the abolition of slavery everywhere in Europe and America and the gradual extension of universal suffrage. And so it seems to me that whatever value system it is that underpinned that development is a complete discontinuity with the ancients. It's a totally different value base.
Yeah, I agree. Yes, exactly. I mean, if I think of it, I kind of think what we have to remember is back then there wasn't an idea of human rights. You are universal rights. You belong to your people, and it's very important that you obey the customs of your people, and other peoples out there in the world are not part of that group, that tribe that you belong to. So why would the same laws apply to them? Kind of in many different ways. They also have no obligation to worship your gods or something like that, Whereas then we kind of develop this idea of monotheism and this idea that, there is one God and there's one set of rights that apply to all humankind, right? So that comes later, and you kind of see it in the development of rights in that it starts to become illegal to treat Christians a certain way. As long as you can say, oh, well, I'm a Christian, then other Christians have to treat you a certain way, even if they don't always live up to that. Or I'm a Muslim, you have certain rights. You have rights and obligations that other Muslims don't have, other people of other religions don't have. So if you look at like Spain, like Andalusia, you would see there's a multicultural society, there's Muslims, there's Christians, there's Jews, but Christians and Jews have to pay a special tax. They're not the same as Muslim citizens of that country, although they're treated quite well compared to how most people treat people of other religions at the time. And then you kind of see that kind of expanding more and more and more and more. And we start to kind of, in a secular world, post-Enlightenment kind of world, loosen that idea from religion and start to say, okay, now it applies to other people. Even if you don't share my religion, this is just a universal human rights, which doesn't really take off until after the Second World War, that idea. And I think some people don't realize how modern, in a way, some of these ideas were. We didn't really get into like the modern human rights era until after the Second World War.
Right. And actually, female suffrage didn't long come after universal male suffrage in many places as well, right? Like in England, for example, I think it was just after World War I that the vote was extended to all men, and in another 10 years to all women, or something along those lines. So it's quite interesting to sort of reflect on that when people make the argument that, women have been terribly oppressed because they didn't have the vote, when actually most men didn't for almost all of that time either.
I think
Correct.
New Zealand was the first country to have universal female suffrage, right? I think
that's
that
right.
was in the 1870s. But suffrage for, vast amounts, large numbers of people was actually pretty rare until the late 19th century everywhere. I mean, obviously the States had its own issues with slavery and emancipation, but I mean, even with the Great Reform Acts in England in the 1830s and the 1870s, they expanded the franchise, but they expanded them to amounts which nowadays just seem tiny. I mean, to well under 10%, I think, even in the 1870s.
Yes, Australia didn't give the vote to Aboriginals until the year I was born, 1967. It's one of the few referenda that's ever passed in Australia. So
Yeah, people often don't realize how recent some of these developments were. Like, my parents were teenagers, at that time. So it's not exactly the ancient past, But I think the big difference is that when we look at Athens, there started to be this idea that class didn't matter, like social class or social economic class wasn't the big thing. And that's how they tend to see it. They're always talking about like the masses kind of people participating and the ordinary citizen participating. So that was kind of the distinction they drew between not only the very rich should have a say, not only the best should have a say, but every man who's a citizen of Athens should be involved somehow, unless you've taken yourself out of the running somehow. Whereas that's part of what we've done. And that's kind of what you guys were referring to a minute ago about expanding the vote from the propertied, originally it was like propertied white men to first usually white men without property, and then maybe women, and kind of going from there, right? So we've kind of gone about this in a slightly different manner. But what's key is that what the Athenians got, what the average Athenian got, was a much higher level of participation than any of these groups have received in modern society. So it's kind of comparing apples to oranges. We have more people involved at a lower level of participation, which has unfortunately consequences for elite capture. And the Athenians had a smaller number of the total people living in Athens involved at a much higher level of participation, which shifted the balance of power towards those people in a really meaningful way.
That's right. I mean, it was even a shock to the oligarchs or the aristocrats in ancient Greece. I mean, one of my favorite passages is in Plato's Protagoras, and Socrates says to Protagoras, well, why is this that when the Athenians are talking about shipbuilding, they'll only listen to expert shipbuilders, and if someone stands up in the assembly who's not an expert shipbuilder, they'll all shout him down, and they'll say, shut up, you're not an expert shipbuilder. But if they're talking about affairs that directly affect the polis, the state, and where it's going to go, anybody can stand up. And Socrates says shoemakers can stand up, lower class people, potters, people like that. Imagine, of course, modern scholars look at the evidence we have, and it does seem like more aristocratic, richer men would speak in the assembly more often than others. However, I mean, that passage and others suggest that, poor men did speak sometimes. So, and they could do that. And famously, the herald stands up at the beginning of the assembly and says, who wishes to speak? And it was a real thing. You could go up and speak in the platform, and so that, I mean, what that would look like now, I suppose, would be something like anyone in New Zealand could go into the parliament and speak when they were having a debate about, economic policy or military policy, whatever it is, the big issues facing the country, and that's not happening now. Okay, so I think we're going to get on to the question of how might we make that more of a reality in the modern world, but first, I want to talk a little bit about threats to democracy, or ways in which maybe it's not going so well. And because we were talking about, the extension of the franchise and, this sort of extraordinary nature of Greek democracy, even though it was very limited also. But it is kind of an extraordinary thing that, 50 or 60,000 male citizens, admittedly, were able to sort of govern themselves freely. And I think personally, it's a wonderful thing that we've had the franchise expand to women and expand to various countries around the world. So in both of your books, mainly in Defense of Democracy, you talk about things, I guess a sort of intellectual strain which has emerged. It's always sort of been around, but it's come back and forth maybe after the Brexit referendum, after 2016, right, when you had both the Brexit result and the Trump election. Can you sort of talk about this, what you describe as anti-democratic strain of thought? What are the main lines of thought there?
Yeah, well, Definitely. I mean, back when I was writing my PhD, of course, you're like, yeah, everyone should be a democracy. You know, people would actually tell me back then, they'd be like, why would you study democracy? Like, so obvious, you know? So yeah, and then came Trump and Brexit, and suddenly everything just changed overnight. And you would get this wave of journalistic or academic opinion saying, well, maybe there should be less democracy, you know, or democracies end when they're too democratic. I mean, whatever that's supposed to mean. And just this idea that people had taken the wrong, you know, made the wrong decision, right? It was just kind of a foregone conclusion among these people that Brexit was the wrong decision. Trump was the wrong decision, the objectively wrong candidate. And therefore, I didn't get my way. We should end democracy. So this was scary, to say the least. I can't say I was entirely surprised by it, though. And I'll tell you why. For quite a long while, there's been what I think of as a kind of development of a sort of courtier class of people who kind of equate democracy with, you know, genteel speaking and having a little debate within however certain parameters, you know. They agree that globalization is a good thing, you know, a completely good thing, you know, in the exact way that it's been exercised, that people who haven't won from this system, who've maybe lost from this system, you know, they deserve their fate, obviously, and now they're just bitter about it. So they were unable to come up with an explanation for why people voted the way they did, because they just refused to acknowledge the explanations that existed. And because of that, they kind of turned into this, like, democracy is the problem. The way we do things is the problem. These people are ignorant. They're ignorant. They're unrational. There's no reason one could have had, for example, let's just say, to vote to leave the EU. The only reason someone could have done that is being like a bigoted, sexist, ignorant jerk, basically. And we must save ourselves from these bigoted, sexist, ignorant jerks. So they kind of came up with all kinds of theories, like epistocracy is one. That's Jason Brennan. He's a philosopher at Georgetown University. Epistocracy is basically just says we should only be ruled by the knowledgeable. And maybe people should have to pass a test in order to vote. Now, interestingly, that test and what counts as knowledgeable is what Jason Brennan thinks are important things. He's a libertarian. Strangely, the more libertarian you are, the smarter you are, as far as Jason Brennan is concerned. Then at the other end of the spectrum, there's kind of a very like left-wing group of people who have very different ideas. They also believe that only, you know, the smartest should rule or the most informed. But interestingly enough, your information, the more your information aligns to their information, the more informed you also are. So we have this they're trying to apply a very subjective standard to politics. And they're trying, in essence, to have politics without politics. You know, politics is a fight. It is about figuring out what you want. There isn't necessarily an objective truth that we as human beings can know in advance. We don't know what is going to turn out to be the best decision, especially since that kind of depends a little bit on who you are. Something might be very good for someone else, but not great for me, for example. And also, you know, the future is just unforeseeable. You know, it would be very difficult to calculate the total economic ramifications of Brexit. You know, I mean, when is your end point? You know, a year after Brexit, 5 years after Brexit, 10 years after Brexit? I mean, circumstances change. It will depend a lot on the other decisions people make to determine that. But yeah, we saw this kind of wave of anti-democratic furor, really, that people could have kind of dared to get in the way of these elite projects of globalization, you know, especially like the European Union project, for example, which is a project that has continued largely bereft of input from the citizens of Europe.
Right.
You know?
I must say, as a libertarian myself, it just strikes me as distinctly odd that another libertarian would argue against the idea that everybody ought to have an equal say in what goes on. That seems to me a fundamental tenet of libertarianism and self-ownership. To the extent that we have government at all, it needs to be as voluntary as possible. Otherwise, it is very much not libertarian. But just to kind of go into a little bit what has happened in Western democracies that has led to this anti-democratic thinking amongst the elites, I wonder if it's actually the fact that, or the possibility that democracies have already undermined themselves and robbed themselves of the things and the values that keep people buying into them. And I think you can certainly explain Trump in those kinds of terms, that a sort of massive class of people who'd felt disenfranchised by the American political system possibly for decades. And many of them perhaps hadn't voted for decades because they couldn't see anybody worth voting for. And then, you know, for all his faults, Trump steps up and at least gives a semblance of speaking for them and voicing their concerns. So, of course, it's no surprise that they suddenly wake up and maybe, you know, some of it is an act of vengeance and some of it is just desperation to be heard.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. And I think it kind of comes back to part of the reason I started doing this. International law has played a role here because a lot of politicians and also corporations, you know, lobby groups have kind of come to realize that you can do on an international level what you couldn't do on a national level. So you have these situations where rather than trying to figure out what you're going to do on a national level, like, and the European Union is a good example there, they say, well, we'll make an EU level rule, kind of sort of behind the scenes, because international law, it's usually, you know, treaties with a few people involved, and then you're bound to that. Mm-hmm. You know, the citizens of the country are bound to that rule. So this is particularly also true in international trade laws. You know, we're going to come to an international trade agreement, and now you in this country are bound to that agreement. A company in another country can sue you if you want to change your laws. So it's a way of kind of locking that in and sort of preventing politics from continuing. Another aspect of that would be independent banks. So years and years ago, the government of the country set the monetary policy of the country for the most part, right? Now the independent bank sets that policy. It's basically all these carve-outs from what we would have called politics have happened. And that means that the ability of the citizens to debate, or even the ability of politicians to do things, has become quite limited, actually. And they've actually rejoiced in not having this responsibility. You know, now politicians can say, oh, well, I can't do this, I can't do that. You know, we couldn't do this. It's against the agreement, the trade agreement we signed, kind of abdicating responsibility for the fact that they signed it, or abdicating responsibility for the idea that they could try to potentially renegotiate it, for example. So international law is very important, but it's been overused and it's been over-relied on, and it's been kind of used to trap decisions, to lock in decisions and take them out of the ability of the citizens to debate or to vote for someone who wants something different. And to speak to your second point, well, maybe some people didn't vote for Trump. I mean, a lot of them voted for Obama. Yep. So they've been voting for change. They've been voting for change for quite a while. And I absolutely agree. If I was the Democrats, if I had been Hillary Clinton, yes, you can complain about Trump, but there's nothing you can do about that. So I think I would more focus on, like, what can I do? How bad of an alternative am I putting out there that people are willing to vote for this guy instead of me? Like, what can I do to win those voters over? That would be the traditional way of thinking about things. How can we get those voters back?
And they seem to have gone to extraordinary lengths to avoid considering any culpability in the problem themselves, haven't they? I mean, I think the 4 years of Trump, it was almost constant complaining about everybody except themselves in terms of what had gone wrong. Hillary Clinton's book about, you know, what happened or whatever. Never once, I mean, I didn't read the book, I have to say, but I didn't hear anybody reporting on her self-reflecting at all. Maybe I could have done this different. Maybe if I didn't call everybody deplorables, they would have liked me more, this kind of thing. So it is very arrogant in a way.
Yeah, I mean, she was a pretty bad choice as a candidate because she was obviously quite intertwined with Bill Clinton. You know, I mean, it's very, very hard to jettison someone who's the policies of someone you've been closely linked to, your own husband, and move forward. You know, I mean, inevitably, you come to a point where you have to acknowledge that some policies of the past didn't work out. You know, politics is about change and moving forward. But if you're so embedded in defending things that happened many years ago and the weak points of those policies have become obvious, then you're going to lose votes because you're kind of saying, no, everything's perfect. Everything's still perfect. And that was in a way their mistake. They said, America's already great. You know, everything's great. Everything's fine. Stop complaining. Like, I don't know of any kind of too many places that are able to win on that kind of campaign slogan in a way. Everything's great. Shut up.
Mm-hmm.
Roslyn, can I just take you back for a minute to Jason Brennan and the sort of epistocrats? Daniel Bell is also one of these, and it strikes me about both of them, Brennan and Bell, that their thought is actually very Platonic. It's very ancient Greek, right? Because Plato has a very similar idea that politics should be done by political experts. And actually, I think that it is, in a way, it's an intuitively attractive idea. I see why people, I would say, fall for it in a sense. Because look, if I have something wrong with my brain, I need brain surgery. I've got a lot wrong with my brain. But imagine I need brain surgery. I don't crowdsource my brain surgery. I go to an expert brain surgeon. I want to get someone who's been to the best schools for brain surgery. So Plato would just want to say, well, surely politics is like that. And I think Brennan and Bell and Brian Kaplan, who did a lot of research on what people know, you can quiz people on what they know about their representatives, and he finds, they don't know very much. And surely that's important, right? Because if you want people running the state, nowadays it's very complex, it's very international, there's lots of technology involved. You want someone who really knows what they're doing, right? So why should we let these people who don't know anything run this complex machinery?
Yeah, that's really great questions. So I grew up in a very small town. I was in the enrichment program, which is kind of like this program for the gifted, since I was quite small, really. And I'll tell you one thing I've learned about that. It doesn't matter how great your idea is if you can't get other people to help you execute it. You can have like the most great idea in the world, but you're in a society, you're joined to these other people. You want them to do your idea. You need them to pay their taxes. You need them to potentially fight in your army. You need them to educate themselves. And in order to do that, you're going to have to convince them that it's in their interest to do so, right? You have to offer them something. So I think where people like Brennan and Bell, one of the ways they go wrong is this idea that it's a great idea. I wrote it down on a piece of paper. So, and I'm the best. And, I have a bunch of degrees that say I'm great. So everyone just do it. Shut up. I'm not going to explain myself to you. I'm not going to explain why it's in your interest. We've all agreed I'm already good. You're going to have to do it, peons, basically. So unsurprisingly, this does not win people over, right? It is amazing what you can convince people of if you take the time to try to see things from their point of view. And you take the time to kind of think, okay, you're right. Why should you do this? Why should you do these things that I think are a good idea? It might be, another thing to remember is, of course, most people can understand a lot more than they articulate themselves. So there is this kind of snobbishness that says, well, you haven't written in Encyclopedia Britannica, what could you know? But it's kind of like learning another language. I feel like when I first started learning German, I could understand a lot, even though I couldn't say it myself, And it's the same with, articulation and maybe being good at verbalizing. Lots and lots of people are able to comprehend a lot more than they say themselves. So they might not be able to write like Shakespeare or Goethe, right? But you still have that ability to comprehend that I think is often missing from the debate as well. We're kind of judging people on a sort of output when really the input is more important. Thirdly, I think this idea that everything's so complex is often just used as a disguise, an excuse to not have to explain it. Oh, it's so complicated you wouldn't understand. So just trust me, I know what I'm doing. That works as long as what you do works. As long as you deliver the goods, it works. But when you don't deliver the goods, it has major consequences. And if something is complex, that's fine. It's our job to explain that to people. It's our duty. You know what I'm saying? Yes, I've read thousands of pages about democracy, but I don't just sit there and say, well, it's too complicated for you to understand. I say, okay, no problem. Let me try to explain things to you. And if you still don't understand, then I bear some responsibility for that. For yourself from lecturing, you're like, okay, let's try this again. Maybe you understand this diagram, right? So you have some responsibility to try to explain things to people and to trust. I think we've kind of lost our ability to trust and have a little bit of faith in people to say, you'll try to understand, you probably will understand to a greater degree than anyone thought possible.
I think all of that is very insightful. I also think there's another kind of technical reason to oppose epistocracy, if that's what it is, that's the right word. And I get my idea from Nassim Taleb's idea of anti-fragility. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that concept, but it applies to a lot of complex systems and the way of getting kind of the best outcomes, or not necessarily optimal outcomes, but better and better outcomes over time. And it works in biological evolution because you've got many, many, many organisms within a species, and so the species is not particularly damaged by the loss of some of those organisms, and therefore the species can sustain loss of individuals and improves its genetic stock as a result. It seems to me that there's a similar argument for mass democracy, that even if people, and I'm not saying they are, but if we were to say they're individually stupid and ill-informed, collectively, maybe not so much, that actually the tides of opinion are informed by people's needs and what they want, and that actually the people that ought to be elevated to rule are the ones who know how to capture that. And so they are actually the people who get voted for. And even though individually people might make poor decisions, collectively you tend towards better outcomes that way. And it seems to me a very great risk in trusting experts to rule is that experts understand one complex thing very deeply. They don't understand the way many complex things interact. And one of the principles of anti-fragility is that the more you try to engineer top-down systems, the more you'll screw it up and get unintended consequences and throw it out of stability.
Yeah, you're 100% correct. You know, you kind of have a foundation of potentially millions of people, right, who are all looking for problems or potential errors or potential pitfalls of your policy. You're going to find those kind of fringe things more. Like most people will, it's like a bell curve, like most people will repeat themselves. You know, most of these ideas won't be anything interesting, but you also really need, and I think you're right, they kind of fail to see this. You need your kind of freak people and your fringe thoughts to eventually bring society forward, right? I mean, someone has to think, hey, maybe the world isn't flat, you know, and think like, how could I do an experiment to show that, you know, and you know, just on and on and on and on and on, right? So yeah, exactly. That's one aspect of it. The other one I think you were trying to kind of get at was this kind of idea of the wisdom of the crowd, which is this kind of idea that if you ask people to guess, you know, how many jelly beans are in a jar, and if you ask 1,000 people, they usually get it right. You know, if you average that answer out, you're correct.
Well, that's another argument that goes, of course, all the way back to the Greeks. So Aristotle, he has this famous summation argument where he says, you know, you get lots of different people together and you can actually produce something better because there's more people involved and they each have their own skills. And he says it's kind of like a potluck lunch. You know, someone's good at making a salad. That's usually me because I can't make anything else. But someone else might be actually good at cooking. So they bring the main course, and then someone's good at making a dessert. So I think, you know, there is a sort of time-honored argument towards the idea that lots of people, collectivities, are actually better at solving particular questions. But I think there's something else going on here, which Michael alluded to as well, which is just that the kinds of questions that face democracies, that face us when we're doing politics, they aren't really that similar to technical questions. I mean, they may involve technical questions. So the question about whether the UK should leave the EU, for example, it has technical aspects. You can have experts come on and say, my prediction, if this happens, is that this is going to happen to the economy, or this is going to happen to agriculture or fisheries or whatever. But ultimately, it's a normative question. It's a question of value, of what we like, what we want to do. And in those situations, it's actually quite nice to ask people what they want, because that's actually what you're trying to capture in a lot of these systems. Things go well, as you were saying, Roslyn, things go well partly when you get people behind them. And I think that's one of the basic premises of democracy as a system.
Yeah, exactly. People often think that sometimes people will say, oh, but you know, how would you know? How would you understand how to like build a ship or build a rocket completely? You think like, you know, you don't need to. You don't need to understand how to build a ship to know if it's leaking or not. You know, like you can kind of say, fine, shipbuilders, you know, as an athletic, you know, go build your ships. I'll look into it when something goes wrong. You know, the democracy kind of to some extent works as a general oversight board in a certain sense, and to say, you know, if that ship doesn't work out, or if it turns out to be awfully expensive for some reason, that's the point where we're going to start investigating how you're building this ship. But not every person needs to have that intrinsic technical knowledge. Most of the time, people kind of go off and do their own things, kind of as you were describing with the kind of potluck analogy. If your salad gives us food poisoning, we will start to examine it at that point, but until then, we'll trust you to make the salad, right? So that's kind of also an aspect that I think often goes under. And then also, yes, you're right. It depends what you're willing to pay for what you want, right? Like any other decision in life, you can buy a fancy car, you have to pay for it. You don't, but if that's what you really want, if that's what you really want, and you say, for that, I'm not going to go on a vacation, then that's your choice. A lot of it is just, saying, what do you want and what are you willing to pay for it? Are you willing to put up with the downsides? Do those not weigh against the benefits to you, right? I mean, someone else might pick a different decision.
Also, in a mass democracy, naturally there's a place for experts. It just might be that they're not the ones who are ultimately in charge. Presumably, we would like our politicians to consult doctors on health policy and educationalists on education policy and so on. I don't know so much about other countries, though I suspect it's the same. What's happened in New Zealand over the last 3 decades or so, ironically enough, is that the public service has been kind of cleaned out of expertise. They've gone for a kind of generic managerial approach where it doesn't seem to matter at all if the workers in the Ministry of Education know anything about education, or the workers in the Ministry of Defence know anything about armies and so on. And maybe it would be, if we want to refocus expertise, it would be better to repopulate our public services with the experts and have them give good advice to governments rather than think that they should just be put in charge.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic. I mean, and I think maybe this is behind some of the backlash in some ways, is that experts feel like they've been denigrated in recent decades, and that, your expertise isn't taken seriously. That, as you say, there's this kind of managerial approach. And I mean, if I think about universities, there's this idea that like people will just add up the pages you've written and give it like a factor according to which journal it was published in, and go, okay, good, we'll hire you, right? I mean, this is an excessively managerial approach to knowledge production, and there's this kind of denigration of doing like a really big, robust experiment, as opposed to like 50 little small ones that don't even prove anything really, and aren't really that useful. So exactly, right? I think there's, to some extent, people feel like, wow, like the effort and time that goes into doing those kinds of things is no longer appreciated. It's just kind of empty output. And that has kind of denigrated the entire profession in a lot of ways. That's true as well. So yes, I mean, of course, in a democracy, experts play an enormously important role, but you might have to just say to yourself, I'm giving you my advice. I genuinely believe this is a bad idea, but I do respect you at the end of the day, and therefore you're kind of giving people the space.
And I guess that's where a free press and the ideas of free speech come in as well, because that way the expert is free to go public and say, I gave them this advice and they ignored it, and look what happened. And then there's a political price to pay. And that seems to me a good mechanism. But when you've got a press that seems to be increasingly partisan and trying to protect certain interests, and free speech under assault, you actually lose that feedback mechanism that keeps politics honest, or somewhat honest at least.
100%. We've completely lost that feedback mechanism. Like people are always saying, you used to kind of be able to get a pretty good idea from reading papers and things, like what's going on. I feel like that's just been like totally cut off, because if I write something for a paper, they will often literally go through and sort of axe the bits that they think aren't advantageous for them, And sometimes they didn't even tell you. They just go ahead and print it. They axe your bits out and they go ahead and print it. So you're like, whoa, like now that looks like that was my opinion when it really wasn't, So, and that gives people a very skewed idea of things. It also, you're right. I think experts have been excluded from media to a huge extent, rather than how you would use to write an article for the media, which would just kind of take it for granted that you'd be like, okay, I'm in the position of journalist. I'm going to go talk to some experts. Do you know what I mean? I'm going to go talk to those experts. I'm going to see what they have to say. I'm going to give them a platform to bring forth their views. It might take half an hour to listen to those. That's what we'll do. It's kind of come into this like very quick way of doing things. I believe it, therefore it's right, And a lot of, I think, the really good journalists have sort of been swept out of that. I mean, I think it's really telling that Glenn Greenwald, who had like the biggest scoop of the century with, Edward Snowden and whistleblowing, is living in Brazil, working on his own.
Yeah.
He's not like the lead reporter of a major newspaper. That's quite shocking considering his contribution to journalism. And I'm sure that a lot of other people are in the same boat.
Well, not to mention Snowden himself, who's in exile in Russia. So.
Of course. Yeah, of course. Right. Exactly. So that's just it. You're kind of saying we want to shoot the messenger in a way. And you're right, that impacts experts in all areas, and healthcare in all areas. We see like millions and millions and millions of articles coming out on, let's just say, coronavirus, but comparatively little just from experts, which we could probably get over in a much shorter period of time. They'd be like, okay, like this is where we are, and onwards we go, right? There doesn't need to be endless debate over most things that are just purely repetitive. So yeah, I agree. There's been a real denigration of like actual expertise in the media. How can you say what you want in a really salacious soundbite? Well, most experts can't say what they found out in a really salacious soundbite, because the results usually aren't that salacious and they aren't that soundbitey, right? So you kind of lose out and get replaced by people who are usually not experts. They're just journalists who like that area, who actually have no idea what they're talking about.
So where do we go from here? So we've got several problems, I guess, at the moment. We've got this free speech crisis. But when I read your book, Beasts and Gods, it actually kind of reminded me of a lot of these old-style left-wing concerns about the structure of power globally. And you talk a lot about the World Bank, how it's structured, and the voting system, and also the International Monetary Fund. And you think that power could be distributed more equally, and I agree. So where do we go from here? Because one of the things that struck me when you were talking about the EU and all these international contracts and how they're sort of removing institutions and politicians from the people is that one possible answer to that would be, okay, let's just have some kind of a global democracy, right? So do you think that's an idea that's possible? Is that something we could do?
No. I don't. Even like, for one thing, you'd have to have a good way of like, at least not at the current stage, you'd have to have a communication between people. So you'd have to have a common language that people are able to express themselves in and communicate. This has already proven a big problem in the European Union, because there's not really like a people interacting with each other. Even if I talk to people I know in Italy or France, like it takes you quite a while to get into like the issues of Italy and France and to kind of get on to what people's main concerns are there. So that's one aspect of it, is that you don't have that global communication. The other aspect is, of course, people have quite radically different needs and concerns. I mean, because countries that are a very, very different state of development. So in a sense, what might be the optimum way for you to move forward as a very developed country is maybe not the optimum way to move forward for a country that's really undeveloped. So I don't think that like a one global democracy is the answer. Also, quite because I'm also, I wouldn't identify myself as a libertarian, but the idea of one world government really doesn't appeal to me. I feel like if there was like elite capture, we'd really be stuck in that situation. It's kind of nice to have different options in the world and different ways of doing things, like, because some of those solutions may prove more viable than others. It's also like kind of an experiment. You might do things one way in New Zealand, we might do them another in Ireland, and we would gain knowledge from those different approaches as well. So I think that's good, So for those reasons, I don't support one global democracy for a whole lot of reasons.
Okay, so what about on the national level? Because you talk also in your book about the pathologies of representative democracy, or let's say the limitations of representative democracy. And there are things like you can predict if you get more funding as a candidate, you're probably going to win more votes. And we all have voting systems that are, the New Zealand MMP one, mixed member proportional representation, I think is pretty good. But, first past the post produces all these distortions, and no electoral system is perfect. So what gives you hope? What are the democratic ideas that you think are going to be able to make our democracy stronger in the future?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I finished my PhD, that was a little bit more than 10 years ago. And at the time I thought, you're right. Representative democracy itself, it's always kind of subject to elite capture. It can come and go, but it's not great. So I thought maybe sometime there'll be like a technological solution to this. People will be able to talk to, the internet will enable people to talk online. It will enable people to make decisions potentially online. You wouldn't have to go. If you read like Rousseau and also Robert Michels, who is this kind of social philosopher, he later became a fascist, but he wrote, they both would write about the fact that it's unfortunately impossible in these big states for people to speak face to face like they did in ancient Greece, so that's like the barrier. You can only get so many people in a room. Obviously, with the internet, you can get as many people in the room as you want. You can be, infinite how many people you talk to and how you make decisions. So it's a way of kind of making sort of referendum democracy cheaper, right? Like in Ireland and in Switzerland, we have quite a few referendums actually, but they're they're slow and they're expensive. If you were to use an internet solution, a kind of internet polis, you could make this happen faster with more deep discussion, and you could make things a little bit more easily reversible. You could potentially combine that with a civil service that is at least at the top levels run with people accountable directly to the people of the nation, as a decision-making body, and therefore ensure a kind of execution. So I think that is my personal preference of a way forward, is the kind of direct digital democracy. And you can see like already we do a lot of participatory budgeting online. So people make decisions about how to spend the budget online. We have like internet voting in Estonia. There are a lot of concerns about security on those things, but it is a way to enable a direct democracy on an Athenian model, on a modern scale.
Right. So that's hopeful. So we're coming up to an hour. I wonder, there's one last thing I wanted to talk to you about, which was sortition. So it's actually something we may even disagree about slightly. And so sortition, for people who don't know, it's selection by lot, random selection. And the Athenians used it, widely. Something like 6 out of 7 of all their officials in Athens, 600 out of the 700 domestic at-home officials in Athens were selected randomly by lot. So only a minority of their officials were elected. And there are people nowadays who think, we should revive this idea. And I think that's actually kind of a cool thought. But as you talk about in defense of democracy, the way this is played out in the literature, in the sort of experimental political science that's being done, is that there are a lot of these deliberative polls or citizens' assemblies, and they select a small number of people. And I think that the critique there, and the critique that you give, Roslyn, is that it basically is sidelining mass participation. Are there other critiques that you have of that? Is that your main problem with the sortition movement?
Yeah, there's a lot of issues, but yeah, that's definitely a big one. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was reading something recently about this movement, deliberative polling, and James Fishkin as well, who I was taught by briefly. And I agree with your criticism of some of these experiments, because I think with Fishkin in particular, I think he meant well, but I do think that what often happens with these is that he gets people together, he selects them by lot, he gets them to discuss politics, he sort of feeds them information about politics. And then what he does is to say, look, we can measure how their opinions have changed. And then he says, good, the experiment's been a success because their opinions have changed. And of course, he comes at it with his own biases. And it's seen as a good sign when people's opinions change in a sort of left-wing direction. But what I was reading recently, it was sort of a partial defense of him and of that movement, in the sense that it was putting it in the context of all this stuff by Brian Kaplan and others, saying that the people are stupid. So what the sortition movement, or the deliberative polling movement, was at the beginning, according to this, was an attempt to deal with that objection, to say that all these people are saying that people can never do politics. And what it was trying to show is, actually, if you get people together in a room and feed them information and get them to discuss, they can have enlightened views. Now, I have the same reservations that you have about that phrase, enlightened views, but that was the thought, I think.
Yeah, no, and I absolutely agree with you. And I do think actually that, I guess as part of like the deliberative democracy movement, I think it's been great for that. If there's something that there's an agreement between us, it is that people are capable of doing this. So we're definitely part of a group that is kind of, you're right, and counter Kaplan and people like that, saying people are just too ignorant, they'll never get to a good decision. So I do think it has definitely shown how people interact with each other. However, unfortunately, I feel like that whole movement in the past few years, they really got on the anti-democracy train in a way. I'm not talking about Fishkin necessarily, but just in general. And kind of started to say, okay, people make bad decisions. Like Brexit was a bad decision, and people wouldn't have made that decision if only they'd had a citizens' assembly. Rather than use this as a way to be a little bit more open and be like, yeah, it's interesting. You got 100 or 200 people together, and they came to, they didn't do anything completely crazy. They didn't vote to, anything about UFOs or something. Yeah. And therefore, we need to use this actually to control democracy. We need to use it to potentially even overturn referendums. We will determine when you've come to that enlightened view. So unfortunately, sortition has become this kind of movement where rather than using maybe a sortition body as a way to kind of show, what the general direction is in the public mood, or in an executive capacity, as you were referring to with the officials in Athens, which I definitely support. Weirdly, my model of democracy probably involves more sortition than the sortitionist model. At the end of the day, they've kind of gone on the kind of crackdown method, and they start saying things like, it's about voice, not vote. It's not about your vote; it's just about your voice. And really, we don't want people voting because they come to the wrong things. But you can express yourself and you can talk a lot about it. So it's really been unfortunate that there's been this kind of schism. I was actually even on the advisory body of a citizens' assembly in Northern Ireland, but unfortunately, we just parted ways pretty drastically on this point.
I also think it's a little bit unfortunate that I admire the deliberative democracy movement as well, and the sortition movement. And for those who don't know, the deliberative democracy movement is basically a movement that stresses democracy as a certain type of discussion, high quality discussion. And I think that's a noble ideal, but that also has the problem that you start to exclude mass participation because, maybe not everybody can argue in exactly the way you want. But for whatever reason, the deliberative Democrats and the sortition people have sort of long been in bed. And, as I say, they're both good movements in various ways. But I think there's something more radical to be said. There's a more radical use that you can make of sortition, which is just to bloody select people and have them give them actual power, and to do that quite often. That's what the Athenians did. They didn't say, oh, let's once in a blue moon have a little group of people who will feed information from a certain perspective and then consult and then not do anything with what they said. They actually use them quite a lot in public life. Do you think that's just a crazy idea in the modern world, or is there a place for sort of mass sortition?
Yeah, I definitely think so. The one important thing to remember, however, is like the Athenians didn't replace the assembly with a really tiny sortition body. They had a lot of sortition bodies that performed all kinds of important functions, but they were quite large compared to the number of people. Like, I think something people often forget is like how obsessed the Athenians were with corruption and preventing corruption and things like that. So these bodies were really, really large compared to the citizen population. If you don't use a body so large, then you're going to run the risk of corruption, or not even the risk, probably the inevitable corruption. And you're also going to run into a situation where your sortition body isn't necessarily reflecting what the citizen body itself wants. You could get out of sync there,
yes, Exactly.
So in modern times, if you're using such big bodies, this is going to be like millions of people. So you're not going to be able to do it 100 people at a time. Like even the Athenians had more people involved, and they were way fewer people. So there's lots of uses for sortition in a democracy. I just feel like not in that legislative capacity. It's really weird that they pick the one thing where most of like the laws and decrees would, the laws and decrees would always go through assembly, and then sometimes in the later democracy laws would also go through the kind of nomothetai body, right?
Yep.
But they've kind of picked like that one aspect and said that's what we want to apply sortition to, rather than like juries, where we already have sortition to some extent, and and civil servants, or the kind of like the executing thing. So those are the things the Athenians used it for a good reason.
And I think there's some recent research by Mirko Cannavaro. I hope I'm getting this right, that he thinks that the nomothetai weren't even necessarily selected by a lot. They may have been a special session of the assembly. But anyway, we're getting really technical now. Nomothetai,
I read that, yeah.
You know this too already, okay. Nomothetai, by the way, in Athens, at a certain point, they decided to have this body of legislators who would maybe help make the assembly's decisions a bit more consistent. I think that's the basic idea, to codify the law and then make sure that people weren't going against the fundamental law of the state. It's that kind of idea.
The two of you have obviously thought about these things much more than I have, but I am a bit of a statistician, and thinking from a statistical point of view, it seems to me that sortition actually could be more or less the same thing as direct democracy. If I chose a sample of, say, 300 people completely randomly from the adult population, they would be pretty representative of that population in their views and ideas. And so if you did that, then those people would probably make similar decisions to the decisions that would be made in a completely direct democracy. Or am I missing something there? And just to hold that question for a minute, it seems to me as well that whether you like sortition or whether you like voting for people depends a bit on what you're trying to accomplish when you put people into power. If you want a truly representative group of people, then you should have sortition, because if you select randomly, that is what you'll get. Whereas if you want people who are good at reading political tides and telling what the zeitgeist is and kind of negotiating policy, then you want people who can win elections because they demonstrate their skill at that by winning elections. So tell me what you think about both of those things, that there's a philosophical difference in terms of what you're looking for, and that if you had sortition, it would actually be, if you did it really randomly, just like direct democracy, really.
Okay, well, there's a bunch of things in there. First of all, I'm actually more for the third option, which is not for voting for politicians or legislating via sortition, but people voting directly on issues, like I would do here in a referendum.
So how is that different than sortition with a truly random selection?
Okay, for a couple of things. Like, first of all, it's not, what they do isn't really random.
But say it was. Say it was.
Okay, imagine it was. I think you'd have to have a bigger sample size than 300, first of all, to get people on board. There's lots of minorities who wouldn't come up in a sample size, 1 out of 300 people.
Okay, let's make it 1,000.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So you need a much bigger sample size, like at least that many, I would say, to start to get a reasonable approximation. But the moment it comes back to what James was saying earlier. Okay, so these 1,000 people are going to what? They're going to talk with each other. They're going to
form a parliament that rules for 4 years or something, and then they get replaced.
Then they're going to start to diverge from what the opinion is of the general population.
Which is why you replace them after a certain number of years.
Yeah, but they're going to start to diverge, even if they just debate like one issue, they're going to start to diverge on that issue. They might come to a different conclusion than than if you did a survey of the population at whole, you would get to, right? I mean, and it could be quite close, right? It could be like the population of a whole, you're getting 49% in favor, which isn't going to do it. And you could come to a decision about these 1,000 people who vote 50.1% in favor, which is going to get a measure passed, right? So you could have a radically different conclusion from these 1,000 people that you've sectioned off versus the society as a whole. So then my question is, okay, however great you think this, and this is just one point, however great you think this is, how are you going to get those other people to do what you want them to do? Are you just going to say, well, you would have wanted this if you could vote, but you can't. We've decided this for you. It's going to be, I think, really, really hard to implement those things. Also, just to bring up some of the other issues, first of all, it's really, really important for people to take an interest in public affairs. So you have this situation where you're saying to people, you're helpless. You can't go out and you can't do what you want to do to try to get the result you want, whatever that is. You can't talk to your neighbors. You can't because you're not going to get a vote and your neighbors aren't going to get a vote. So there's no point doing that. There's no point having these conversations with your family members. There's no point, thinking what do you really think about this thing? Because you're not getting a vote on it in the end. So you're kind of putting people in this very passive situation where you're kind of infantilizing them and saying, it's not up to you. Your voice doesn't matter. You can just sit at home, and these things will just happen. And eventually, maybe you'll be called up to decide on something. And, you can make that decision then 20 years from now. The other thing is, of course, you're getting back to that problem you mentioned earlier, individual issues rather than kind of a general conversation about how these things affect every other freaking part of society, right? So that's also a huge obstacle as well. Rather than having this continuous iterative process where you're like, well, unfortunately, policy A had a minor side effect on policy D that we didn't foresee. We're going to have to go back and correct that just a little bit at a time. You're kind of annihilating the space to do that, and to make those minor adjustments in the society as a whole. So those are also huge problems, and we don't learn. The idea of sortition is you're going to go into this special chamber and you're going to get a crash course from some experts. And of course, how are they selected is of course also kind of a big issue. But even supposing, they were wonderful, people kind of learn a little bit over time. You learn by how did it work out last time, and well, I tried something like that similarly, right? So you're kind of depriving your entire population of the ability to learn and the ability to be involved and their ability to take responsibility and accountability as individual citizens for the decisions in that society. You can go back to people now and you can say, well, did you vote? And how did you vote? Or, you can go out and you can canvass people to try to vote in a referendum here. You really have a lot of options to get involved, and you're now depriving people of all those options and kind of turning them into passive. The vast majority of the population is turned into just, passive, non-people.
Thank you. I think that's a very convincing rejoinder.
You've put your finger on I guess one of the sad things about the deliberative polling movement and the citizen assembly movement, which is that you start off with two ideals, basically representativeness in even a statistical sense, which Fishkin is quite good at, and then this idea that you want that people can be changed by deliberation, and that their views can change, and that they can sort of go places in conversations. But the problem is that by demonstrating that they can go places in conversations, that then makes them less similar to the people they've been selected from. So then you kind of lose out on the representativeness front. But I would say, just to go back to your sort of criticism of representative democracy, I do think that kind of situation is at least a bit better than one of the problems with representative democracy, which is you effectively get this sort of elite class of MPs, and whatever country you do it in, it just seems to sort of constitute itself as an elite. That people with a bit more money, a bit more education, just find it a bit more charisma, maybe just even good looks and things like that. A bit on TV more, they just find it a bit easier to get into Parliament, and so you end up having this reflection of a particular social class. And so in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum, even though they decided, I should say, I'm a British citizen as well, we decided to leave, then some huge percentage of MPs were responsible for putting this vote through, but they actually were pro-Remain, much more so than the population. So there's often this big misfit between what the elected elite are thinking and what the people are thinking. So I guess my view is, this is probably yours as well. I think I think the Athenians can guide us here. They use sortition in various ways, in lots of different ways. And one of the ways was to select the council, right, as you know. So the council of 500 was selected by lot. And then what the main job that had was to prepare business for the assembly. And then the assembly, male citizens could turn up probably about once a week, once every 10 days, and vote directly on proposals. And there's a bit of wiggle room to introduce your own proposals. But basically, that's a good situation, I think, because it sort of combines the two things. And when you do need a sort of focus group or something, I think sortition is often a good solution. But I agree with you that ultimately the people have to be sovereign, and what better way of having the people speak than just actually asking them? That's the power of a referendum, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we did that in Ireland, right? In Ireland, we had the Citizens' Assembly, and we had a few referendums based on that. Now, a lot of those suggestions that they made were never tabled. So we kind of had the government then cherry picking the bits that they wanted to go forward, which were, I'm going to say, I ran into elections here, so I would do a lot of canvassing. Those are not probably the views of they wouldn't have been people's top picks. They were definitely issues, but I'd say economic issues were definitely more of an issue for people than the social issues that we ended up having a referendum on. If you'd ask people to rate those issues according to importance. So, but we did do that, right? That's fun. And you can have a citizens' assembly. You could also probably just ask people in a survey, because you're probably not going to get much of a difference on kind of what is a priority, But if you want to do it that way, that's fine. We did it here, but we did have referendums. And I think that's a part that they're missing. And so I don't know why. In a way, I find it a little bit baffling that the sortition and the deliberative democracy movement, they had this, kind of formula that didn't work too badly in Ireland, actually. And then they took it and decided there shouldn't have been a referendum in Brexit, and that was the wrong thing. So to me, it's very revealing of the mindset there. The mindset isn't, okay, let's just let things bubble up, and see where it takes us. This isn't some 60s hippie movement. It's very much well, that was the right decision, so it was okay. But if it's the wrong decision, we'll override it. So that I find really, really, really scary. So. Yeah. It's very concerning to me that you're kind of using this idea, and they're kind of using this idea, it's inclusive of, 0.001% of the population, it's, and everyone gets along and it's all representative. They're kind of using it to sort of sell this idea that at the end of the day, they're okay, but within this narrow box of opinions I've already approved, I have my agenda. And as long as you suit this agenda, it's happening. But the moment you don't, it's off.
Yeah, exactly. It is a scary thing. And I think some people at the moment, in our current moment, they're starting to think, well, this is a problem with democracy because there are all these people online and you get these Twitter mobs and so on and so forth. And I've even had moments of this myself, but I sort of come back to the fact that, I mean, the people who use social media are kind of like, they're not exactly the same group as MPs, obviously, but I mean, they're a demographic slice, and they're not actually the people. That's the thing. Social media, I think, seems very much like Vox Populi. It seems like the voice of the people, but I think that that's an illusion. So I think I've sort of come out of this period with my commitment to democracy strengthened in a way, because I think a lot of the problems that we're seeing now are the product of a kind of cultural elite that's trying to impose itself. And I think the way out of that is to continue to give ordinary people more power and more opportunity.
There would certainly be lessons to learn from social media setting up something like a digital democracy. You would not want a platform like Twitter to be your people's parliament, would you? I mean that encourages this kind of extreme polarization and attacking and so on, just because of the format of how people interact on it. So you'd need to put a lot of thought into how you set up a platform that was going to maximize good argumentation and exchange of ideas, rather than just kind of nasty tribalism.
Yeah, I know. That's something I get a lot too. People are like, oh, you want to vote on Facebook? It's like, we feel like nobody ever said that. I mean, these are social media corporations developed by people in Silicon Valley. They really have nothing to do with us whatsoever. I mean, it's digital. Okay, but so are your tax forms at this point, you know? So that's it, right? So yeah, like those things, yeah, they weren't designed to be any kind of democratic form, obviously. There is like, I guess people see it as democratic that anyone can get on there in this kind of really vague kind of sense. But yeah, I mean, one thing about social media is this: does it result in decisions? Like, you know, do you wake up in the morning and people are like, oh yeah, I mean, tax rates going down 3%. We decided on Twitter yesterday. You know what I mean? Like that doesn't happen, right? It really is just about talking. And unfortunately, it's this kind of elite conception of democracy that says this is a debating society. You know, I had a debate and I kicked that guy's ass and yeah, there we go, win for me, right? Yeah. I mean, as opposed to this idea that like, okay, we're making a decision, suddenly 99% of all the things you were thinking become irrelevant. You have people forced to be there just because they don't want a decision that goes against them, which means that the 20% in America, 20% of the adult population has a Twitter account. Those people, that means 80% of people don't. So you're looking, as James said, a very small slice, a very self-selecting slice of humanity. And then on top of that, most of those people don't use it a whole lot, right? I mean, there's very, very few accounts that use it a lot. So you kind of have this situation where you're able not to participate. You have this way of like, you're like, so what? I don't care. Arguments get bad. I just take a hike, kind of, you know? Combined with the fact that nothing's going to happen anyway. So unfortunately, what does it attract and what does it maintain? I would say narcissists, like in a pathological sense, you know, people who really feel like they're getting somewhere by having the argument for the 80 bazillionth time, which is actually psychologically very, very abnormal of most people. Like very, very small percentage of people enjoy this. The vast majority of people are like, I'm done. And so that's what we kind of have on Twitter now, is this kind of like hall of mirrors that you're talking about, like a hall of mirrors full of narcissists, which is like the most toxic situation kind of there is. If anything, it would be great if we could just kind of set sail to them. Put them off into the sunset and do something completely different. But, you know, when you have to make decisions and when you're forced to be in there, those people prosper a lot less. I mean, a lot of these things I'm telling you about they're already happening. This isn't like something where we have to invent. These things all exist already. So you kind of do see like a lot less of that behavior, because when people are antagonistic, other people don't vote in their favor. If you're like, you know, I'm pro-choice and, you know, you're just like a misogynist, like, you know, like I'm not going to, I realize we're on radio here. So, you know, but if you're really, really nasty, you know, all men are trash kind of type of thing, people don't like you.
Right. Yeah.
And therefore, you're not winning voters to your cause. So they kind of, to some extent, those people don't like being on there. Like they kind of voluntarily leave to some extent because they're like, oh, this is no fun. And to another extent,
Twitter.
Other people hate them. Yeah, you know, so you've got to think of like the incentive and the rewards. Social media, it's like, yeah, it really is like kind of like the worst combination you could possibly come up with.
So, well, I guess we'll design a better system in the future. so that we can harness the power and the wisdom of the crowds, and honor everybody's equal preference. Because I think that's also an idea that's sort of gotten lost. I mean, I think in the academy, this idea of democracy is just aggregation of preferences is very passé. But I actually kind of like it, because it sort of means whatever kind of smackdown argument you just had, you may just still have a view that you like and a preference that you like, and I think the one person, one vote system just gives you that dignity. I don't really know why I dislike this candidate or I dislike this policy, but I feel it, and that it sort of gives you that power. You don't even need to explain it to someone. I think that's actually also a reflection of this idea of political equality. We should probably stop there, but thank you so much for coming on, and I highly recommend Roslyn's books, Beasts and Gods, and In Defense of Democracy, and I'll put links to them in below the video. So yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Roslyn. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you guys too. It was great coming on, and thanks very much.